The announcement first appeared in the diplomatic bulletin at the far corner of Nathan Rell's console, sandwiched between a tariff dispute on helium imports and a maintenance notice about faulty gravity stabilizers on Dock Ring C. He almost ignored it. Most liaison officers learned quickly that 90% of diplomatic traffic was ceremonial noise disguised as urgency. He took a sip of the station's synthetic coffee, immediately regretted it, and tapped the notice open just to distract himself from the taste. A Vrithian noblewoman, identified as Lady Kyrva of the Third Spire, was seeking a human spouse for a formal diplomatic marriage. The wording was precise, almost painfully formal, yet there was something faintly awkward about it, as if the translators had struggled to convey the tone of the original message. Requirements included psychological compatibility, willingness to relocate, and a tolerance for significant physiological differences. Nathan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Significant physiological differences, he muttered. That usually means tentacles. His co-worker Leon, seated across the narrow operations bay, glanced up. Tentacles pay better, she said. Hazard compensation. Nathan scrolled further. An image appeared. Lady Kyrva stood in a ceremonial hall, easily 3 meters tall, her forearms folded in a posture that somehow managed to look dignified rather than intimidating. Her face was strikingly human in structure, though her long ears swept back elegantly past her dark hair. The additional pair of arms rested slightly lower on her torso, relaxed but clearly powerful, the musculature visible even beneath the layered fabric of her attire. Nathan stared at the image longer than he expected. Well, Leon said. Tentacles. No, Nathan said slowly. Arms. Leon wheeled her chair over and leaned in to look. Her eyebrows climbed steadily upward. Oh, she said. That's a lot of arms. 4, Nathan said. Efficient, really. She stared at him. Efficient. Well, imagine carrying groceries, Nathan said, or assembling equipment. You could hold tools and parts at the same time. Leon blinked. Nathan, that is not the first thing most people think. He shrugged. Most people are boring. The application link sat at the bottom of the announcement, glowing faintly. Nathan hesitated only a moment before opening it. The form was surprisingly straightforward. Personal history, psychological evaluations, a section about adaptability in multicultural environments. Nathan filled it out methodically, barely noticing the time passing. When he reached the final question, why are you interested in this arrangement? He paused. After a moment, he typed, because differences don't bother me. Problems can be solved. Curiosity is more useful than fear. He read it once, shrugged, and submitted the application. The confirmation message appeared instantly. Thank you. At present, you are the only applicant. Nathan leaned back again, staring at the words. Huh, he said. Leon looked over. What? I might have accidentally applied to marry a giant alien diplomat. Leon stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then she said very calmly, I'm going to need you to repeat that sentence. 3 days later, a Vrithian transport arrived at the station. Nathan watched it through the observation window, trying not to feel the weight of what he had done. The ship was enormous, its hull patterned with geometric ridges that caught the light of the nearby star. Docking clamps extended, locking into place with a deep metallic resonance that vibrated through the deck. A delegation emerged, tall figures with long ears, moving with measured grace. Even the smallest of them stood nearly 2.5 meters tall. Nathan suddenly became very aware of how short humans were by comparison. One of the delegates approached him, inclining his head politely. Liaison Officer Nathan Rell? That's me, Nathan said. You have been invited to meet Lady Kyrva. The corridors of the Vrithian vessel felt cavernous, the ceilings high enough to make Nathan feel like a child wandering through a cathedral. The air carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, something like cedar and cold metal. He was led into a chamber lined with tall windows, and there she was. Kyrva stood near the far wall, one pair of hands clasped behind her back, the other resting lightly at her sides. She turned as Nathan entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Nathan's first thought was not fear. It was scale. Everything about her was larger. Her stride, her presence, even the way she seemed to occupy space. Yet her expression held a trace of uncertainty, as if she were bracing herself for discomfort or awkwardness. "You are Nathan," she said. Her voice was calm, deep, and surprisingly warm. "Yes," he said. Then after a brief hesitation, he added, "You're taller than I expected." One of Kyrva's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I am 3 meters and 8 centimeters. That's very precise. I prefer precision." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. I once assembled a plasma relay without reading the instructions, and it exploded. Precision is important." For a moment, Kyrva simply looked at him. Then unexpectedly, she laughed, a soft, genuine sound that echoed faintly in the chamber. "I was told," she said, "that humans often become nervous when meeting me." "I get nervous around people who whisper too much," Nathan said. "You seem straightforward." Kyrva studied him, her long ears tilting slightly as if adjusting to a new sound. "You are not intimidated," she said at last. Nathan considered the question honestly. "No," he said. "Curious, yes. Intimidated, no." "Why?" He glanced at her forearms. "Because having forearms seems useful." There was a brief silence. Then Kyrva laughed again, louder this time, one of her hands covering her mouth in a gesture so unexpectedly human that Nathan found himself smiling. "Useful," she repeated. "No one has ever described me that way." They began to talk, not about treaties or politics, but about ordinary things. Kyrva asked about life on human stations, about gravity preferences and food that required fermentation. Nathan asked about Vrythian architecture and how tools were designed for four-handed use. Time passed without either of them noticing. At one point, Nathan attempted to demonstrate how humans balance multiple tasks at once by juggling 3 small data modules. He dropped all of them within seconds, and Kyrva effortlessly caught 2 before they hit the floor, her movements so smooth they were almost invisible. "You see?" Nathan said, picking up the 3rd module. "4 arms, very practical." Kyrva shook her head, still smiling, and for the first time in many years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her composure. Not obligation, not duty, something lighter, possibility. Nathan did not expect to be invited to stay aboard the Vrythian vessel, yet within hours of their first meeting, he found himself assigned quarters larger than his entire apartment, back on the orbital relay. The ceiling alone was so high that the lights seemed like distant stars. He stood in the center of the room, hands on his hips, turning slowly. "I could rent this place out," he muttered. The translation note on the wall chimed politely, interpreting the statement as a logistical inquiry about occupancy limits, and began projecting a list of safety regulations in 3 languages. Nathan hurriedly waved it off. A soft knock sounded at the doorframe, more a vibration than a sound. Kyrva stepped inside, ducking slightly even though the doorway was clearly built to accommodate her height. "I wish to ensure your quarters were acceptable," she said. "They're enormous," Nathan replied. "I think I lost my sense of direction somewhere between the bed and the desk." Kyrva glanced around, one pair of arms folded loosely, while the other adjusted a small control band at her wrist. "These chambers are designed for junior attendants," she said. Nathan blinked. "I don't want to see what senior attendants get." For a moment, Kyrva looked puzzled. Then she understood and laughed softly. The sound echoed against the high walls. Warmer this time, less restrained than before. They walked together through the vessel later that day, Kyrva guiding him through corridors that curved like the interior of a great shell. The ship was alive with quiet activity. Tall Vrythians moved gracefully between consoles, their long ears flicking subtly as they communicated in low voices. Transparent panels revealed glimpses of machinery, gravity regulators humming like distant thunder, coolant streams flowing in luminous channels. Nathan paused at one viewing port and stared at a chamber where dozens of articulated robotic arms assembled components with flawless precision. "That reminds me of home," he said. Kyrva followed his gaze. "You also use such machines." "Yes," Nathan said, "but ours usually jam at the worst possible moment and require someone to hit them with a wrench." Kyrva looked at him. "You strike your machinery?" "Only gently," Nathan said. "With affection." She shook her head, though her expression carried the faintest trace of amusement. As they continued, Nathan became aware that others were watching them. Not openly, but in the subtle, careful way, people observed something unusual. A human walking beside Kyrva was clearly not a common sight. "You are being observed," Kyrva said quietly, noticing his glance. "I notice," Nathan said. "Should I wave?" "That would increase the observation," she said. "Ah," Nathan replied. "Best not then." They reached a broad observation deck where the stars stretched endlessly beyond a curved field of transparent alloy. The ship had entered transit, and the distant light of a nebula shimmered like colored smoke drifting across the darkness. Nathan leaned against the railing, gazing outward. "I never get tired of this," he said softly. Kyrva stood beside him, her presence casting a long shadow across the deck. "Nor do I," she said, "though I have crossed these routes many times." There was a pause filled only by the quiet hum of the engines. "You must understand," Kyrva said at last, her voice more thoughtful now, "that this arrangement, it is not entirely simple. Many among my people believe a union with a human is impractical." Nathan glanced up at her. "Because I'm small?" "That," she admitted, "and because humans are often perceived as fragile." Nathan considered this. "We are fragile," he said, "but we're also stubborn. Sometimes that balances out." Kyrva looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of that statement. Later in one of the communal dining halls, Nathan encountered his first practical challenge. The tables were built at a height comfortable for Vrithians, which placed the surface somewhere near his chest. He stood there for a moment, staring at the arrangement of dishes far above him. Kyrva watched silently, curious to see how he would react. Nathan looked around, spotted a storage crate against the wall, dragged it over, climbed onto it, and sat down as if this were perfectly normal. "That," he announced, picking up a utensil, "solves the problem." Several nearby attendants paused, staring. Kyrva covered her mouth with one hand, her shoulders shaking slightly as she tried, and failed, to suppress a laugh. "You adapt quickly," she said. "I dislike being hungry," Nathan replied. The meal itself was an experience. Vrithian cuisine relied heavily on crystalline fruits and layered proteins that changed flavor depending on temperature. Nathan spent several minutes trying to determine which utensil was meant for which dish before finally giving up and asking Kyrva directly. "I appreciate honesty," she told him, demonstrating the proper use of a slender, three-pronged instrument. "I appreciate not accidentally launching food across the table," Nathan said. By the end of the meal, conversation had become easier, more natural. Kyrva spoke of her homeworld, vast plateaus of silver grass, cities carved into mountainsides, skies crossed by enormous migratory creatures whose wings blotted out the sun. Nathan listened with quiet fascination, asking questions that were practical rather than ceremonial, questions that seemed to please her more than flattery ever could. When they parted that evening, Nathan walked back through the wide corridors alone. He felt tired, but it was the pleasant fatigue that came from new experiences rather than stress. In her private chambers, Kyrva stood by a tall window, looking out at the slow drift of stars. She found herself replaying their conversations in her mind, the ease with which Nathan spoke, the absence of hesitation in his manner. He had not once looked at her with the guarded politeness she had come to expect. Instead, he had treated her as if she were simply a person. The realization felt strangely unsettling, and yet comforting at the same time. Far below, deep within the ship, the engines continued their steady pulse, carrying them both toward a future neither of them yet fully understood, but which, quietly, almost imperceptibly, had already begun to change them. The following morning, Nathan woke to the sensation that the bed was still far too large for him. He had drifted diagonally across it during the night and still had space to spare. For a moment he lay there staring at the high ceiling, listening to the faint vibration of the ship's engines, feeling the peculiar calm that came from being very far from anything familiar. A soft tone sounded near the wall console. A message from Kyrva appeared, translated into human script. "If you are awake, I would like to show you something." Nathan dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor, still adjusting the cuff of his sleeve when a young Vrithian attendant approached to guide him. The corridors were busier than the previous day. Technicians moved with quiet urgency, carrying crystalline data cores and diagnostic tools, shaped for four-handed operation. Is something wrong? Nathan asked as they walked. The attendant tilted his head. Not wrong. Preparations. For what? For arrival. Nathan frowned slightly but said nothing more. Kyrva was waiting in a chamber near the forward observation ring. When Nathan entered, she was standing beside a large holographic projection of a planet slowly rotating in midair. Its surface shimmered with oceans and wide continents marked by luminous cities. My homeworld, she said. Nathan stepped closer, studying the projection. It's beautiful. It is complicated, Kyrva said. Beauty often is. She began explaining the geography, pointing with one hand while another adjusted the scale of the projection, a third highlighting trade routes, and the fourth resting loosely at her side. Nathan watched with open fascination. I keep thinking how efficient that must be, he said. Kyrva glanced at him. Efficient? You can explain things and operate the controls at the same time, Nathan said. If I tried that, I'd probably turn the planet upside down by accident. That would be inconvenient, Kyrva agreed gravely, though her eyes showed amusement. They spent nearly an hour studying the projection, discussing cities, climates, and the cultural divisions of the Vrithian Commonwealth. Nathan asked questions that were practical, sometimes unexpectedly so. How do buildings handle structural stress when most citizens are your size? He asked. We design for it, Kyrva replied. I suppose you would, Nathan said. Humans mostly design for spilling coffee. Kyrva looked at him. You spill coffee frequently? Only when gravity shifts unexpectedly, Nathan said. There has been no gravity shift, Kyrva observed. Nathan nodded solemnly. Then I have no excuse. Later that day, Kyrva invited him to visit one of the ship's training decks. The chamber was vast, lined with adaptive surfaces that could change texture and density at command. Several Vrithian officers were engaged in coordinated exercises, moving with fluid precision that was almost mesmerizing. Nathan watched as one officer lifted a weighted bar nearly as long as Nathan himself, handling it with two arms while adjusting a control panel with the others. That, Nathan said quietly, is impressive. Kyrva studied his expression carefully. She had expected discomfort, perhaps even unease. Instead, she saw only genuine interest. Would you like to try one of the exercises? She asked. Nathan hesitated, then shrugged. As long as you promise not to laugh. I promise nothing, Kyrva said. A few minutes later, Nathan stood before a simplified training apparatus designed for smaller species. It consisted of a series of balance platforms that shifted unpredictably. He stepped onto the first platform confidently. It tilted sharply, and he windmilled his arms, barely keeping his balance. Kyrva watched, one hand covering her mouth as she tried to maintain composure. I have it under control, Nathan said, immediately slipping and landing on the padded surface with a soft thump. The nearby officers paused, uncertain whether to react, until Nathan sat up and raised a hand. I meant to do that, he said. This time Kyrva did laugh, openly, the sound ringing through the chamber. Nathan found himself laughing too, brushing dust from his sleeve. I think I'll stick to diplomacy, he said. That is wise, Kyrva replied, still smiling. As the day passed, their conversations began to drift into more personal territory. They walked along one of the ship's quieter corridors, where a long, transparent wall revealed the slow swirl of a distant nebula. You are not what I expected, Kyrva said after a time. Most people say that, Nathan replied, usually with disappointment. I do not mean it that way, she said. I know, Nathan said gently. Kyrva hesitated, then spoke more quietly. Many who met me before, they tried to be polite, but I could see it in their expressions. The comparison, the discomfort, the sense that they were standing beside something too large, too strong, too different. Nathan leaned against the railing, looking out at the stars. People get uncomfortable when they can't imagine themselves in someone else's place, and he said, And you can? I try, Nathan said. Besides, I've always been the smallest person in most rooms. You get used to adapting. Kyrva considered this, her long ears tilting slightly. You do not feel small now, she asked. Nathan glanced up at her towering height, then back at the endless stars. No, he said, I feel normal. The simplicity of the answer settled between them, quiet and steady. That evening, as the ship continued its journey, Kyrva found herself lingering longer in conversation, delaying the moment when duty would call her away. Nathan, for his part, felt the unfamiliar sense that time was passing too quickly. Somewhere in the depths of the vessel, preparations for their arrival continued. Ceremonial schedules, diplomatic briefings, countless details that would shape the future of two worlds. But on a quiet observation deck, a human and a Vrithian stood side by side, watching the stars drift past, speaking of small things and large ones, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming less like strangers and more like something neither of them had expected to find. The day before their arrival, Nathan discovered that Vrithian ships possessed something he had never expected to find aboard a diplomatic vessel: a weather garden. It occupied an entire inner dome, an artificial environment designed to simulate the shifting climates of Kyrva's homeworld. Warm wind moved through tall silver grasses, and faint clouds drifted beneath a transparent ceiling that projected a sky in soft shades of violet and gold. Nathan stood at the entrance for several seconds, simply taking it in. The air smelled faintly of minerals and distant rain. Kyrva approached from behind, her footsteps almost silent on the smooth stone path. "This place helps many of us remain calm during long voyages," she said. "I can see why," Nathan replied. He stepped onto the path and immediately stumbled as the ground shifted slightly beneath his weight. "It adjusts to the stride of Vrithians," Kyrva explained. Nathan regained his balance. "I feel like I'm walking on a polite earthquake." Kyrva gave a small laugh, the sound blending with the whisper of the wind through the grasses. They walked together, and for a while neither of them spoke. The sky projection gradually shifted, clouds thickening as distant thunder rolled softly across the dome. "You control the weather here?" Nathan asked. "Yes. The system responds to emotional and atmospheric variables," Kyrva said. "It was designed to mirror the rhythms of our homeworld." Nathan glanced upward. "So if everyone aboard becomes anxious, it storms?" "In extreme cases, yes." Nathan folded his arms thoughtfully. "That explains a lot about human politics. We would never stop having thunderstorms." Kyrva's laughter came more easily now, and Nathan noticed that she no longer seemed guarded when they were alone. They reached a shallow stream that cut across the garden, its surface glowing faintly from bioluminescent organisms drifting in the current. Kyrva stepped across effortlessly. Nathan attempted to follow, misjudged the distance, and landed with one foot in the water. He looked down at his soaked boot. "I meant to test the temperature," he said. "And?" Kyrva asked. "It is wet," Nathan replied gravely. Kyrva shook her head, smiling, and offered one of her hands to help him up the opposite bank. Nathan hesitated only briefly before taking it. Her grip was gentle despite the obvious strength behind it, and for a moment he was acutely aware of the difference in scale between them. Not as something intimidating, but as something quietly remarkable. They continued walking until they reached a high overlook where the grasses parted to reveal a view of the ship's inner structure far below. Transparent layers of corridors and chambers stretched in intricate patterns, illuminated by soft white light. Nathan leaned against the railing. "I keep forgetting this entire place is moving," he said. "We will enter orbit within 12 hours, Kyrva said." Nathan nodded, but his expression grew thoughtful. "You seem concerned," Kyrva observed. "Not concerned," Nathan said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About what happens next," he said. "Ceremonies, negotiations, endless meetings. I've attended enough diplomatic events to know how exhausting they can be." Kyrva's expression softened slightly. "They are necessary." "I know," Nathan said, "but necessary things are rarely enjoyable." There was a pause filled with the distant sound of wind moving through the garden. "Kyrva," Nathan said at last, "may I ask you something?" "You may." "Why did you do this? Not the diplomatic part, the personal part. Why agree to marry someone you had never met?" Kyrva was silent for a long moment. The artificial sky above them darkened slightly, clouds drifting across the projected sun. "Because," she said quietly, "I believed it was the only way to be chosen." Nathan turned to look at her. "In my world," Kyrva continued, "I am respected. I am powerful. I am admired in a distant way. But admiration is not the same as closeness. Those who approach me did so because of my position, or because they wished to prove something to themselves. And those who did not approach—" She stopped, searching for the right words. They were afraid, Nathan said gently. Yes, Kyrva said. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. Nathan leaned back against the railing, looking up at the darkening sky. Fear makes people miss interesting opportunity, he said. Kyrva studied him. And you are not afraid? I am afraid of many things, Nathan said. Explosive decompression, corrupted navigation systems, coffee that tastes like engine coolant. Kyrva's lips curved slightly. But I'm not afraid of people, Nathan finished. Thunder rolled softly above them, and the first artificial raindrops began to fall, light and warm. Nathan looked up, blinking as the drops landed on his face. Is this part of the system too? Yes, Kyrva said. A passing storm. They stood there in the gentle rain, the sound of water soft against the grasses. After a while, Nathan said, You know, if storms responded to human emotions, I think they'd be much louder. Perhaps, Kyrva said. But they might also pass more quickly, Nathan added. Kyrva looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Something quieter, steadier, as if a long-held tension had eased just slightly. The rain slowed, the clouds thinning as the artificial sky brightened once more. Far beyond the hull, the stars continued their silent drift, and the great ship moved steadily toward Kyrva's homeworld, carrying with it two lives that were beginning, in small and unexpected ways, to intertwine. The ship entered orbit just after what Nathan's internal clock insisted was early morning, though the concept of morning had become increasingly abstract during the voyage. He stood beside Kyrva on the command deck as the planet filled the great forward viewport, a vast sphere of silver oceans and deep green plateaus streaked with long ribbons of cloud. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It's larger than I imagined, Nathan said quietly. Kyrva tilted her head slightly. Most things are, when seen closely. The descent shuttle was prepared within the hour. Unlike the vast diplomatic vessel, the shuttle felt compact, though still enormous by human standards. Nathan had to remind himself that the seats were not oversized. They were simply built for people Kyrva's size. As the shuttle broke through the upper atmosphere, the hull vibrated gently, and a faint amber glow spread across the viewport. The sky outside shifted from black to deep violet, then to a pale gold as sunlight scattered through unfamiliar atmospheric layers. Nathan leaned forward, watching the surface approach. Cities appeared, built in sweeping arcs that followed the natural contours of the land, their towers rising like sculpted stone rather than rigid structures. It looks organic, he said. Our architects prefer harmony with terrain, Kyrva replied. I once saw a human city built on 3 different fault lines, Nathan said. Harmony was not the priority. Kyrva gave a quiet laugh. The landing platform stood at the edge of a vast terrace overlooking a valley filled with shimmering vegetation. As the shuttle settled, Nathan felt a flicker of nerves for the first time since this journey had begun. Are you all right? Kyrva asked. I think so, Nathan said. I just realized I'm about to meet an entire planet that's been hearing about me for weeks. You are not being judged, Kyrva said. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Not excessively, she amended. That's comforting, he said dryly. The reception party waiting outside the shuttle was impressive even by diplomatic standards. Tall Verithians in formal attire stood in precise rows, their long ears adorned with delicate metallic ornaments that caught the sunlight. At the center stood an older woman whose posture carried unmistakable authority. My mother, Kyrva said quietly. Nathan inhaled once, steadying himself, and stepped forward beside her. Introductions were formal but not unfriendly. Kyrva's mother regarded Nathan with a steady, thoughtful gaze that seemed to weigh not only his words, but the way he stood, the way he looked at Kyrva, the ease or tension in his posture. You have traveled far, she said at last. Yes, Nathan replied, though I suspect Kyrva has traveled farther in her life than I have in mine. The older woman studied him for another moment, then inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging an answer that satisfied her. The palace itself was carved into the side of a mountain, its halls open to the sky in places, allowing warm air and distant birdsong to drift through the corridors. Nathan found himself constantly looking upward, marveling at ceilings that seemed to vanish into the light. At one point, while following Kyrva through a gallery lined with enormous sculptures, he misjudged the length of one step and nearly walked straight into a decorative column. Kyrva caught him easily with one hand before he could collide. "I'm beginning to appreciate the practical advantages," he said, straightening his jacket. "Of my arms?" Kyrva asked. "Yes," Nathan said. "They prevent embarrassing accidents." "That is not their primary function," she said. "A missed opportunity, then," Nathan replied. Their laughter echoed faintly through the hall, and several attendants glanced at them in mild surprise. Kyrva noticed but did not seem troubled by it. Later that evening, a smaller gathering was held in one of the inner courtyards. Lanterns floated in the air, suspended by invisible fields, casting soft golden light across the stone terraces. The atmosphere was less formal here, the conversation quieter, more personal. Nathan found himself speaking with a group of Vrithian scholars who were fascinated by human engineering. One of them asked whether it was true that humans sometimes repaired spacecraft using adhesive polymers designed for domestic use. "It depends on how urgently you need the spacecraft," Nathan said. "And this works?" "Sometimes," Nathan admitted. "Other times it becomes an educational experience." Kyrva, listening nearby, shook her head with quiet amusement. As the evening wore on, Nathan became aware of something subtle but significant. The initial curiosity directed toward him had begun to soften. The glances were no longer merely analytical. They carried traces of acceptance, even warmth. When the gathering ended, Kyrva walked with him along a quiet balcony overlooking the valley. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flowering plants that glowed softly in the darkness. "You handled today well," she said. "I tried not to trip over anything important," Nathan replied. "You succeeded," Kyrva said. They stood in silence for a while, watching distant lights flicker across the landscape. "Nathan," Kyrva said at last, "do you regret coming here?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "No," he said. "I think I would have regretted not coming." Kyrva looked at him, and in the quiet glow of the lanterns, something in her expression softened. Not the careful composure of a diplomat, but something more personal, more unguarded. Far below, the valley shimmered under the alien stars, and the vast world around them felt less like a distant place and more like the beginning of something neither of them had fully expected, but both were slowly beginning to understand. The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm, divided between formal obligations and quiet moments that felt far more significant than any ceremony. Nathan quickly learned that Vrithian schedules were built on cycles of light rather than fixed hours, and more than once he found himself attending a briefing that his body insisted should have been in the middle of the night. On the third such morning, or what he believed was morning, he arrived at a council chamber only to discover he was nearly an hour early. The vast room was empty except for Kyrva, who stood near a wide window studying the distant plateau. "You are early," she said without turning. "I was afraid of being late," Nathan replied. "Humans have a long history of arriving late to important events and then pretending it was intentional." Kyrva glanced at him, faint amusement in her eyes. "That would not be convincing here." "Then I'm glad I was early," Nathan said. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, enormous winged creatures drifted on warm air currents, their shadows sliding slowly across the cliffs. Nathan watched them with quiet fascination. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all a very elaborate dream," he said. "If it is," Kyrva replied, "it is a very persistent one." The council sessions themselves were less dramatic than Nathan had expected, though no less exhausting. Representatives from various regions debated trade quarters, resource exchanges, and migration agreements with the calm intensity of people who understood that entire worlds depended on their decisions. Nathan spoke only when necessary, offering human perspectives in clear, practical terms. He noticed that Kyrva often listened carefully to his suggestions, sometimes incorporating them into her own proposals. The ease with which they began to anticipate each other's thoughts felt almost natural, as if they had worked together for years rather than weeks. During one particularly long session, a technical advisor began explaining the structural limitations of joint orbital facilities in such intricate detail that even the translation system seemed to struggle. Nathan leaned slightly toward Kyrva and whispered, "I think he's describing the molecular composition of boredom." Kyrva covered her mouth with one hand, shoulders shaking slightly as she suppressed a laugh. Later, when the session ended, she said quietly, "You should not say such things." "I didn't," Nathan said. "I whispered them." Outside the formal halls, life in the palace revealed itself in small, unexpected ways. Nathan discovered a workshop where Vrithian engineers experimented with adaptive materials, and he spent an entire afternoon watching a device that could reconfigure itself into different tools depending on the user's grip. "This would revolutionize human repair work," he said. "It would prevent your adhesive polymer incidents," Kyrva said. Nathan sighed. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "No," Kyrva said calmly. One evening, they walked through a lower terrace where young Vrithians practiced coordination exercises, learning to move all four arms independently. Nathan watched in fascination as a group of children balanced spinning rings while solving logic puzzles projected in the air. "I struggle to drink coffee and read at the same time," he said. Kyrva smiled. "Coordination is learned." "I think I would need several additional brains," Nathan replied. "Perhaps one would be sufficient," she said. Nathan placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. As the days passed, Kyrva began to feel a change within herself that she found difficult to name. The quiet tension she had carried for years, the constant awareness of being observed, judged, measured, began to fade when Nathan was near. He spoke to her without hesitation, without careful distance, and the simplicity of that acceptance felt more powerful than any compliment. One evening, as the light of the setting sun turned the stone terraces to gold, they stood together overlooking the valley. "Nathan," Kyrva said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you applied, did you truly believe this could work?" Nathan considered the question carefully. "I believed it was possible," he said at last. "Most things are, if people are willing to be patient." "And if they are not?" "Then they never find out what might have happened," Nathan said. Kyrva looked out across the vast landscape, silent for a long moment. "I have spent much of my life believing I was too much," she said quietly. "Too large, too strong, too different." Nathan shook his head. "You're exactly enough," he said simply. The words were spoken without drama, without emphasis, and perhaps because of that, they felt more sincere than any grand declaration. Kyrva felt something inside her shift, like a door opening slowly after being closed for a very long time. Far below, the lights of distant settlements began to appear, one by one, like stars rising from the ground. "Nathan," Kyrva said after a while, her voice softer now, "do you ever feel afraid of what comes next?" "Always," Nathan said, "and yet you continue forward." "Yes," he said, "because the alternative is standing still." They stood there in silence, watching the night deepen around them. Somewhere in the distance, a low, resonant call echoed across the valley as the great winged creatures returned to their roosts. For the first time since the arrangement had begun, neither of them thought of the future as an obligation or a duty. They thought of it as something they were beginning, quietly and steadily, together. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a stillness that seemed to settle over the entire palace. Nathan stood on a high balcony overlooking the valley, watching the pale light of dawn spread slowly across the silver grasslands. The air was cool, carrying the faint sound of distant wings as the great sky creatures crossed the horizon. He adjusted the formal coat he had been given, still not entirely convinced it fit correctly. The tailor had assured him it was perfect, though Nathan suspected the man had never before designed ceremonial attire for someone nearly a meter shorter than everyone else in the hall. Behind him, footsteps approached, light, precise, unmistakable. Kyrva stepped onto the balcony. She wore ceremonial armor unlike anything Nathan had seen before, layered plates of pale metal that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Each of her four arms bore slender bands etched with patterns that seemed to shift as she moved. Yet despite the grandeur of her attire, her expression was thoughtful, almost quiet. "You are awake early," she said. "I wasn't sure I could sleep," Nathan replied. "Too many thoughts." Kyrva nodded slightly. "I understand." They stood side by side, watching the valley brighten. "Do you ever feel," Nathan said after a moment, "that everything important happens very slowly until suddenly it's happening all at once?" "Yes," Kyrva said softly. A distant bell sounded, low and resonant, echoing across the terraces. "That's our cue, isn't it?" Nathan said. "Yes." The ceremony took place in a vast open hall carved directly into the mountainside. Sunlight poured through the high archways, illuminating rows of guests, Vrithian dignitaries, human representatives, observers from allied systems. The scale of the gathering might once have unsettled Nathan, but now he felt strangely calm. As he walked beside Kyrva, he realized that the nervousness he might have felt weeks earlier had been replaced by something steadier. Confidence, perhaps, not in the ceremony, but in the person beside him. The vows themselves were simple, spoken in both languages. They spoke not of obligation, but of partnership, of shared responsibility and shared life. When it was Nathan's turn to speak, he hesitated only briefly before saying, "I came here because I was curious. I stayed because I found someone worth staying for." A quiet murmur moved through the hall, but Kyrva's gaze never left his. When the ceremony ended, the formalities dissolved into celebration. Music filled the terraces, played on instruments that shimmered with harmonic overtones, unlike anything Nathan had heard before. Lanterns rose into the sky, drifting like slow-moving stars. At one point, a group of young Vrithians invited Nathan to join a coordination game involving spinning rings and shifting platforms. He lasted exactly 12 seconds before losing his balance and sitting down abruptly on the edge of the platform. "I believe," he said, slightly breathless, "I have demonstrated my species' limitations." Kyrva, watching nearby, laughed openly, and the sound carried across the courtyard like music. As the evening deepened, the celebrations gradually softened. Guests departed, the lanterns dimmed, and the vast palace grew quiet once more. Nathan and Kyrva walked together along the same balcony where they had stood that morning. The valley below shimmered under the light of unfamiliar constellations. "It is strange," Kyrva said, "how different everything feels now, though the world itself has not changed." "Maybe we have," Nathan said. Kyrva considered this. "I spent many years believing I had to make myself smaller," she said quietly. "Less imposing, less overwhelming." Nathan looked up at her. "You were never overwhelming," he said, "just impressive." Kyrva smiled faintly. "You see the world differently than most." "I see people," Nathan said. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant wind. "Nathan," Kyrva said at last, "are you happy?" He thought about the long journey, the uncertainty, the strange new world that now felt strangely familiar. He thought about the way Kyrva laughed more easily than she had when they first met, about the quiet understanding that had grown between them. "Yes," he said simply. Kyrva's expression softened, and for a moment she reached out, drawing him gently into an embrace. With 4 arms, the gesture felt different, not tighter, not stronger, but somehow more complete, as if she could hold not just his body, but the space around him as well. Nathan laughed softly. "All right," he said, "I admit it. 4 arms are definitely an advantage." "I told you," Kyrva said. They remained there for a long time, watching the stars. Far below, the lights of the city shimmered, and beyond the horizon, trade ships moved like slow, silent comets, carrying news of the alliance that had begun, not with grand strategy, but with one quiet decision made in the corner of a console screen. Nathan thought of the person he had been then. Curious, perhaps a little restless, uncertain what he was looking for. He realized now that he had not been searching for adventure or recognition. He had been searching for connection, though he had not known how to name it. Beside him, Kyrva stood tall and unafraid, no longer apologizing for her strength, no longer shrinking from the space she occupied. The future stretched before them, vast and unknown, but no longer lonely. And somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of 2 lives moving forward together, the distance between worlds felt just a little smaller.